Oh, benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 142 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this lecture is intemperance and perhaps insensibility too, the vices associated with temperance. And I am Dr. Thibault. So the first article we get into with the vices associated with temperance in itself, this is only the second question out of about 30 questions within the section on temperance. So we're getting right into the preliminary vices. Once we get into the parts of temperance, there's also vices associated with the parts of temperance. This is in a generalized way, intemperance. We looked at temperance in question 141. Now we're looking at intemperance in question 142. Although the first article starts with more insensibility, which is a little bit different. So insensibility, you can kind of picture a person being a bit like a stoic, a person who doesn't want to take into consideration the emotions. They don't want to follow pleasure. They don't want to engage in any of that kind of the desires, perhaps somewhat of a Buddhist perspective, avoiding the desires. Insensibility is a rejection of the natural pleasures that are connected with natural preservation of the person or species. So, as you remember from temperance in question 141, we were dealing primarily with food, drink, and sex. Those are the three issues primarily dealt with temperance. So, insensibility is saying, I'm not going to look at the pleasures associated with food, drink, or sex. I might do them out of duty, but I'm not going to do it out of pleasure. St. Thomas is against this. As a good Aristotelian, as a good Catholic, with the incarnation of Christ, we are not against the pleasures. We're not against natural desires. St. Thomas says these natural desires are put into them by God. Why do we want to eat good food? Why do we want to have something to drink? Maybe not necessarily alcoholic, but why do we want something to drink? Why are we drawn to sexual appetites? Because there's something good in there that God has put that in there to draw us to it more. If people didn't desire sex, the species would have died out a long time ago. There was something inherently good with it. People don't starve to death because they just aren't interested in food, typically. People want to eat. The idea that we get hungry or thirsty is drawn into it to get us to do what we naturally should do. So St. Thomas points that out. So the desire is not to be insensible. Temperance is often about the desires and about the pleasures, but the proper ordering of temperance is not a rejection of the pleasures, a rejection of the senses. So insensibility would be a vice. Now, St. Thomas points out that this is different than abstinence. So there are times in which we do reject some of the natural pleasures in life. We do reject some of the the natural desires. We get hungry and we don't eat. You might have sexual attractions, but you don't act on them. You're thirsty and you might not drink, for example. We might do this if you're a soldier or an athlete. Right? There might be times in which you have to sacrifice it for one's own personal desires or for the good of the commonweal as a soldier. A person might personally take on penance, abstain from different pleasures, or a person could be focusing on the divine life or a life of contemplation, and part of that would be to abstain. So this is different than insensibility because it doesn't deny that those pleasures are pleasurable, but it says, I'm going to, for a time or for a reason, I'm going to abstain from that. I'm going to put my priorities in different order, putting the divine above the bodily, putting the common good against my own personal desires, uh, knowing that I have to curb my pleasures as a penitent is a practice, a spiritual practice. So these are done in abstinence according to reason. If it's done according to reason, it's not this insensibility. Insensibility would be a philosophical disagreement. It would say that the pleasures themselves are bad, and that's just not part of the Catholic ethos or part of the Aristotelian one either, for that matter. Insensibility. Then we move on for the next three articles into intemperance. We move away from insensibility to intemperance. If you look quick, they might even look the same. We're dealing with a new term. Now, Aristotle calls intemperance a childish sin, and St. Thomas dedicates a whole question to it being a childish sin. Now, we have to determine if it is a childish sin, define what is childish in a sense. So St. Thomas says, well, there's two ways of looking at children. One is that kind of innocence of a child, or Christ calls us to become like little children. And that way, being childlike is a very fine thing. There's nothing wrong with being childlike. And if a child is like being a child, then that's their nature. This childish sin that Aristotle is talking about is in a different way. First, we're not talking about children, we're talking about adults who are acting childish. Now that's not good. That's not a good thing. And he breaks it down in three ways in which adults can be childish. And one is the concupiscence of desire is something that is disgraceful. So, a grown man who spends his day getting high and playing video games and eating junk food, right? It's a kind of a disgraceful thing. It's not befitting of his nature, right? If you left it up to a child, what a child would like, they would eat chicken nuggets and French fries and candy all day long, right? And they always just drink soda and if you gave them the choice, do you want to go to school or do you want to go play video games? They would always choose video games, right? This is that pure concupiscence of desire. Now, a child should not be allowed to do these things as they desire, but even worse for an adult, right? An adult, you should have outgrown this, otherwise you have that childish sin. It's a bit of a issue within the present culture is that just heard a lecture on that today with Jordan Peterson talking about how one of the effects of birth control since the sexual revolution is that women don't get pregnant. If women don't get pregnant, then men don't have to take responsibility. They can have sexual relationships without consequence, and they never quite have to grow up. Versus before the advent of birth control, if a man wanted to engage in a sexual relationship with a woman consensually, presumably, you would have to be ready that children were coming. So you better get your job in order. You better get some money saved. You better, this woman's going to be stuck with these children that you're producing. So you better be prepared, right? You can't sit on the couch playing video games all day when you have children coming. Since birth control, now men don't have to grow up. So this is a bit of this intemperance, right? Intemperance and childish sin. The next is a connection in terms of the results. The results of being childish. Maybe the example of this are the kids in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. They they get to do whatever they want whenever they want. You know, all of all of the bad kids kind of had that in common, that they were self-willed people, young people. Whether it's watching TV or getting whatever they wanted or eating whatever they wanted, there was a matter of being self-willed. So the results of being childish, intemperately childish, is that you are a self-willed person. And self-willed people are people who don't do well in relationship with other people. Um, because it's all about the ego. It's all about them, which is a bit of a. Will get in the way of your human flourishing and your ultimate happiness, as if you are so egocentric, self-willed. And then the last thing in connection with intemperance being that childish sin is that the remedy is the same, both with spoiled children and spoiled adults. How do you get a full-grown person out of being childish? How do you get an actual child out of being selfishly childish? Is that they need some type of constraint. They need some type of rule and discipline. You can't eat whatever you want. You have a bedtime. You have to get up at a certain time. You got to do your homework before you watch TV. Right? The discipline, the restraints within life gives a person a sense of responsibility, and it moves a person out of being childish, particularly adults. Right? It might take a while for children, but adults should get beyond this, get beyond intemperate behavior. But within that one is a lot. It's a diagnosis. It's a points out the symptoms, and it gives a cure, all within uh, Article 2. So that's a good one there. Now, St. Thomas asks in Article 3, what is worse, cowardice, sometimes called timidity, or intemperance, which is worse? And St. Thomas says intemperance is worse because it's more voluntary. If a person is a coward, they're afraid. They're afraid and they run away. If you think of somebody who sees a snake on the ground, or even a rubber snake, right, they might jump, right? It's kind of an involuntary flight out of fear, versus intemperance, which is, am I going to play this video game and eat junk food this afternoon? That's not a flight. That's not an instinctual thing. If somebody is running from death, running from danger, it's more instinctual. If a person says, I'm just going to sit my rear end down on this couch and do nothing for the rest of the afternoon, that's more voluntary. The latter is more voluntary. So therefore, it's worse. That's starting with Aristotle and then moving into St. Thomas's reasons. Um, a person can have a sounder mind when one is being intemperate. One is sober. One is not filled with emotion, right? If cowardice can deal with the emotions, um, fear, emotion. We're not dealing with a fear here. We're dealing with laziness, right? Laziness. This is therefore a person has a sounder state of mind and they're choosing to sin. Therefore, it's more grievous. It's more voluntary, very similar to being of a sound mind. A person is choosing to say, I am going to sit on this chair for the rest of the afternoon and play video games. Right? This is completely voluntary. Um, if you're going down the street and a building's on fire and you have to decide whether or not to rush in and try to save somebody's life, this is a little less voluntary. You have to act in the moment, and you have to make a quick decision, and you don't know all the facts, and you're driving on adrenaline. And this is less voluntary. Whatever you decide was less voluntary than if you're saying, well, am I going to play video games for the rest of the afternoon? That's more voluntary. Therefore, it's a graver sin if you choose to do the wrong thing. And it's easier to find a remedy for intemperance, according to St. Thomas. And his reason for this is, he says, we deal with issues of temperance and intemperance on a daily basis, right? If it's dealing with food, every mealtime is a practice in temperance. Between meals, if the issue is snacking, between meals, all day long, then is an issue of temperance. If it's alcohol, it's if a person has an alcohol problem, it's every minute, every hour, every day. There's a practice in it, and if it's sex, the same thing. Right? This is a daily practice versus cowardice. Well, if it's an issue of when you see a burning building, what do you do? Well, how often do you see a burning building or a major car accident or something like this? Unless you're a firefighter or a first responder, you probably don't see this on a daily basis. Therefore, you don't get to practice as often. So because temperance uh, has frequent abilities to practice this, you have an ability, if you put your mind to it, to remedy your action, right, by curbing your desires. Um, and St. Thomas lastly points out in response to objection one, I think it's a good one, is to succumb to a weaker force is proof of a greater vice. I think that's a great line, something probably St. Augustine would write, right? One of those poetic lines. Right? If a person has a knife put to their throat and says, sin or I'll kill you, right? If it's death or sin, you still have to choose the right thing. But it's a great force upon you, right? That you could see why somebody might sin uh, in that situation, or even worse, like sin or I will kill your children in front of you and your spouse. Right? Person's under that amount of duress, they might succumb versus um, intemperance, where there's absolutely no pressure whatsoever. If you succumb to no pressure at all, then uh, that's pretty bad. Like people who you don't go to church on Sunday because you just don't. It's different if you were in a place where you could be thrown in jail for practicing your faith, or you could be killed for practicing your faith. If they don't, it's less sinful on them than somebody who doesn't go just because I didn't feel like it. Right? That's just intemperance. Okay. And lastly, St. Thomas says intemperance is the most disgraceful sin. And I think you could probably get a little bit of that throughout. It doesn't mean it's not it's not the gravest sin, right? And murder would be far worse, or blasphemy far worse in terms of grievous or grave sin. But this one's the most disgraceful. It's kind of, when I think of it, it's like, what is the most pathetic, right? What is the most, just you pity the person. It's just, uh, it's opposed to the honor and glory in which you are called. If each one of us, the baptized anyway, are called to live a life of magnanimity, we want to go back to fortitude, greatness, right? To become a great saint, become a great leader within the commonweal, to be a great husband, father, mother, wife, grandparent, to do this in a glorious way, a grand way, this is what we're called to, right? The image of Christ is what we're called to. The opposite of that would be somebody living such a tiny life, pusillanimity, right? Going back again to fortitude, living such a tiny life, and not like Saint Therese, who did small things with great love, but just sleeping late, having no impact. You don't have time you don't pray. you don't eat well, you don't serve, you don't show gratitude, you just, eat fast food and play video games. Um, it's just disgraceful, right? It's like a pig rolling around in their own feces. Right? This is just not fit for human life. This is the great sin. So it's the most repugnant because it's against human excellence that we're called. It's reducing humans to just, we say animal nature, but animals live according to the way they're supposed to. It's below animal, right? It's sub-animal. It's below one's dignity, uh, and it dims the light of reason, right? So in some ways, it's like it's it's not being what you could, and it's making you worse. Right? It's dimming the light of reason from all the clarity and beauty that virtue arises. You're called to be great, and instead you traded it all for nothing. Right? Traded it all for nothing. That's just graceful, right? So in conclusion, oh, I wrote a wrong one. I said intemperance is a sin. It is, but insensibility is a sin, um, because we are people who should be following our passions. The passions are typically good, right? If they're natural passions, but they have to be put into the light of reason and done in the right order. But we're not a people who rejects the emotions. Not part of our theology or philosophy. Intemperance is a childish sin, causes us to not grow up, not develop, and the way out of it is to grow up, to take responsibility, and to curb our desires. Intemperance is worse than timidity, cowardice, because it is more voluntary, more freely chosen. Intemperance is the most disgraceful of the sins. This is lowering your human dignity to being like a pig, right? To be lowering you to be just demeaning your human nature, aspiring to nothing, living for nothing, living small. So that's what we have for intemperance. The vices associated with temperance, and next we will move on to the integral parts of temperance. So that will be, I was like getting into the parts.